thank you everyone who's joining us for this session. And I'm pleased to welcome Aparna, is that correct?
That's right.
Balasundaram?
Yeah, you're brave. Balasundaram, that's right.
And Damini Kapur.
You got that right too.
Fantastic. And they're going to talk to us about a Gear Up, which is a resilience and psychological well-being virtual training toolkit for new employees. It's a very important topic because it's been a strange time to join an organization over the last year. So I'll hand over to both of you. Thank you very much for coming and welcome. I'll mute myself and my video, but I'm here if you need me.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And, to all that are attending, and I'm hoping more will kind of join, as we continue. Just wanted to say, and I do know we have someone from London, we have someone from India. So, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, and good night, I guess, to all as you sign in from different parts of the world. And we're really happy to be here. Damini and I, we represent the Global Wellbeing and Resilience team at Wipro, the digital operations. And we look forward to spending the next hour or so with you as we present our virtual onboarding training that we successfully piloted across different geographies with different groups of people against, of course, the landscape of COVID. So just very quickly about myself again, I'm Aparna, and thank you, Majin, you pronounced that well. It's Aparna Samuel Balasundaram. I know that sounds like a mouthful. And I'm a consultant to Wipro, and I lead the main design of their evidence-based mental health, well-being, and resilience frameworks and strategies across an employee's life cycle. So from pre-hire to post-exit, we try to cover, the entire gamut. And these culturally competent, and that was really important to us because we work across different geographies. So it was critical that whatever we create has to be culturally competent. And of course, it had to be clinically sound. So everything that we do is based on what we call evidence-based practice or practice knowledge. And this program that we're going to share with you today, or rather the intervention, was designed through the lens of what we call an occupational and psychological health model. So that's what we have the pleasure of sharing with you today. And on just a side note, I also happen to be a doctoral candidate at UPenn and a teaching associate, and I've done some guest lectures at Columbia University. So that's a little about me. So I thought before we start, because I know, we all are in different spaces as we come in, including Imogen and Miranda. I know you've been, doing this for a long time, the last couple of days. I thought we'll just do a quick check-in, and part of the reason it was important for us to do this is just to help each of us connect with each other, ground ourselves, and also showcase to you as a parallel system that this is part of what we also do in our Gear Up intervention program, right? That every session that we start with a check-in, and we feel that's really even more critical when it's a virtual space because, the distractions on, the virtual space are so much more than if we were, all in the same geographical location, breathing the same air. So, hence a check-in we found from our own experience is a great way to just connect to the group, right, and create that common space. So for all of us that are here, I'd just like you to kind of think about one thing that you're grateful for today, right? And I know we're at different parts of our day, from the morning, afternoon, evening, and the night. But and if you feel comfortable, put it in chat. I believe there's a chat function here. If not, just think about one thing you're grateful for as we speak and engage in this moment. And I'm just going to pause for about 10 seconds while we think about that and, realize that is also grateful for something. Good, thank you. Thank you for thinking about that. So good. So as good, and I see there's some things that have come up in chat. So thank you guys for putting that in. Okay, so as we kind of move to the, so thank you all for sharing and thinking about that. As we move to the next slide, I'm going to hand it off to Damini, who's going to take us through the next couple of steps. Thanks, Damini.
Hi, Aparna. Thanks. Hi, greetings, everyone. I'm Damini, and a little bit about me. I'm based out of Hyderabad, India, and have had the privilege of being associate with Wipro and working with Wipro for over 11 years now. Currently, I'm the HR lead for one of our customer accounts, where we provide a range of services across multiple geographies. Uh, Now, a little bit about Wipro. Wipro is a leading information technology consulting and a business process services company, and is recognized globally for the comprehensive portfolio of services that we provide our customers. We harness the power of cognitive computing, hyper automation, cloud analytics, and emerging technologies to help our clients adapt to the digital world. Together, we discover ideas, connect dots, and build a better and a bolder future for our over 1,100 clients. We are 1,97,000 plus strong, and have a presence across 66 countries across the globe. Um, Wipro came into existence a little over 75 years ago as an oil company, but we have transformed ourselves many times over the years, and we've built and enhanced our capabilities, the scope of services, and our client base, and have now established ourselves as a leader in business transformation. Um, Aparna, if we move on to the next slide, we can give you a glance of what we're going to cover about the program, the why, the how, that's the design and methodology, and content of the program. Uh, Give you a little walk through the program, and then let you know what our findings have been about the program. Um, Before we get, if we could move on to the next start, before we get started, and before I hand over to Aparna, here's a slide that we do share at all our, sessions with our participants, um, to ensure that we all commit to each other, to be present, and giving our 100% to the session. With this, let me hand over to Aparna to take you forward. Take this forward. Thanks, Aparna.
Thank you so much, Damini. And I think one of the key things that we want to kind of, highlight again, if you see, we put this, the word co-construction process, and that's something that you'll see even as we built this intervention program from the ground up. We kind of made sure that there was, a constant collaboration with all the stakeholders. So here's what we're going to do to begin with. That we're going to start with the why, right? So for the next, 35, 40 minutes, we're going to go through this entire roadmap with 5 different markers, starting with the why, right? So the why is essentially this, right? When we kind of looked at, the need, right, that we were kind of dealing with globally, and I think this is something we can all relate to, right? That globally, COVID and the whole work from home situation became the backdrop against which all organizations, right, needed to almost go back to the drawing board, reevaluate what their people learning needs and training methodologies would be. And we did the same at Wipro, and I'm really proud to say, and with a pinch of humility mixed in there with the pride, that I think we were really agile and very proactively we were able to embrace this need, right, to be innovative, while still keeping an increased focus on people well-being and still maintaining business needs, right? And for those of us from the corporate space, we know that it's this fine balance, right, of meeting business needs, but of course, more importantly, how do we make sure that our people are taken care of, right? And we continue to invest in them. So it's almost like to us, that was part of the foundation from which we needed to build this design. So as you can see, there's a funnel, and there are these 3 different pieces, right? So one area that we needed to focus on was what we call the space of content operations, right? So content operation is a relatively new skill set where a person takes a role of what we call a digital guardian as they review what's known as UGC in the industry, which is user generated content. to ensure that any inappropriate content is filtered out and the internet remains safe for all of us, for you and I, right? And our families and our children. So this is a critical role. Now, as part of our people care investment in this space, we proactively provide our associates with a well-being and coaching services to empower them with resilience building tools and also to promote positive well-being. So in that context, we initiate our people care investment, as we like to call it, at the very beginning stage, right? So even before they start engaging with the work, as part of the pre-process onboarding training is when we introduce them to this, this onboarding training program known as Gear Up. And part of the reason that we want to do, this even before they start work is couple reasons. One is to help them build awareness and see the value in self-care and emotional well-being. Two, the people that conduct this training are also the coaches that are going to continue to be with them once they're on the floor, right? Once they start with the work. So I think it was important for us to kind of plant that seed even before they started work, and they were able to recognize names and recognize faces of the coaches, right? As they came into the system as new employees. And I think many of us can relate to this, right? As we walk this part, COVID and, of course, the work from home situation has kind of amplified the need for all of us to pay close attention to our well-being, right? So this was the context around why we needed to proactively invest in the well-being of our people. Okay. So here's how we did it, right? So the second piece is the how. Now that we understood the why, which was a context, we now kind of move to the next phase, which is the how. How did we build this program, which we call Gear Up, from, as I mentioned earlier, ground up, right? So for us, it was really important that there were three elements, right? The first, of course, is the felt need, right? Is this even important to people? Because very often, in our experience, from my past experiences are that we build beautiful products and programs, and guess what? Nobody uses it, right? And it's just sitting on the shelf, on the training shelf somewhere. So it's really important that anything we do is in response to a felt need, right? It has to be relevant to our people. So we did focus group discussions, we got feedbacks from different stakeholders, and that kind of fueled part of the content, right? The second was, given that this was new, right? In the pre-COVID days, we would have had these trainings face-to-face, different geographies, different sets of trainers. But now in this whole COVID landscape, we realized that while we had to continue to onboard people, and we onboarded over 1,500 people through this program, it was important for us to make sure that the effectiveness of the programs were not diluted too much, right? Hence, we had to use specific elements and methodologies that would work even for a virtual online training. The third element, as you see in the little green circle, is, like I mentioned, we love this, but everything we do has to be evidence-based research, has to be based on practice knowledge, has to be based on industry best practices, right? So we make sure that all these three elements, these three little round circles, were added up, and almost, if I could, create a visual for you, we kind of threaded all of this together using what we call a participatory approach, which essentially means we were just sitting in our nice little offices creating stuff. Anything we created involved the participation of all the stakeholders, including, those who had not gone through Gear Up, but had been, had been newly onboarded without the Gear Up program, and almost kind of touching base with them and asking them, hey, you know what if you had gone through a program like this, right? What would you have liked to have seen? So it was kind of, making sure, even from a perspective, that we were getting those elements in, right? And the key to all of this was we had to be agile. We had to recognize the hurdles very quickly, because believe me, when we did pilot this, we started with a small group of just 20, 25. It wasn't perfect. I wish it was perfect. It wasn't perfect, right? I mean, that's the reality. But what was good is that our team was able to recognize the obstacles and hurdles very quickly, and we were able to pivot because the need was constantly evolving, right? So that's the Gear Up program design. The next is, along with the how, is how did we do this? Everything that we've done, and I know this is not, news to anyone, but the best methodology is an experiential methodology, right? Where people actually do, they listen, they take part, because then they're able to take ownership of this. So this is an example of some of the different methods that we used, and we're going to share some of that later on in the simulation piece. Um, Here's what that looked like, right? So this was the implementation markers. If we have it as, a roadmap from step 1 to step 5, we started with what we call a pre-survey, which is the knowledge, attitude, and belief, right? So even before people were exposed, for lack of a better word, to the training program, we were able to assess some baseline knowledge and attitude and behavioral aspects, right? And this was important because this would feed back, to step 4 and 5, which would give us a good sense of, we think we're doing a great job, but are we really doing a good job or not? Is it really having an impact? So that fed into our feedback and evaluation process. Step 2 and 3, and was really the meat of the program. And I apologize if there are any vegans here, because I know that meat can be a word that's hard to use, or hear rather. But step 2 and 3 was really the bulk of our program, right? So we started with module 1, 2, and 3 as pre-processed. So even before they had any experience of what the nature of the work was going to be, we just focused on, hey, you know what, this is just about you, about building your resilience toolkit. So it was helping them gear up, and hence the name gear up and be prepared for work once they started. So a lot of investment was in the pre-process. We designed it as a 5-hour. And then once they actually went through the onboarding training after 2 to 3 weeks, we then did the other 3 hours, which was the post training. And you'll see, though we initially created this as an 8-hour program, through part of our learning, we realized that we needed to, shave some things down. And I'll talk about that later towards the end in our learnings. So that's what we have there. So we looked at, the design methodology and the content. So the content, like I mentioned, which was in phase 2 and 3, was 5 modules. Each module was about 60 to 90 minutes. I'm not going to go into the details of all of this, but essentially the idea was introducing people to the concept of what we call psychological and occupational safety. The reason being, we wanted people to take emotional ownership of their well-being, right? And all of us, over here, and those that might, listen to this later on, know that life creates stress, work creates stress. That's a given, right? So knowing that I'm entering a workspace, or even just in my life journey, I'm going to deal with stressful moments. It behooves us to proactively think about, how am I going to protect myself, right? And that's that psychological and occupational safety aspect. Not going to go too much into details on all of this, but it's up there, because I feel we'll get lost in the details. Okay, we just had to put some Indian spices out there, right? So these are the success enhancers that we felt was about getting the right spices and the right amount at the right time, right? That truly went into, we believe, helping us design something that, even as per the feedback, seems to be meaningful. So every session that we did, right, had these 7 elements. And as a parallel process, for example, when I did the check-in with all of you, was warm up, right? And then, when Damini, took us through the context and told us about, how we all have to be present 100% in spite of the distractions, was part of, the second step, which is setting context and introduction. So similarly, we had 7 elements that we followed as part of the storyboarding for each session, right? And we felt that it was important to do this. The next slide is really busy, and I apologize. I'm not going to go to the details, but again, it's just a breakup of these 7, right? For example, the warm-in is a quick check-in, right? We had an optional mindfulness activity to, again, just to bring people into the same space. And like we said, the reason it was important to, spend time on that is because, unlike a physical space, when the moment I enter a physical door, I'm part of the group that's sitting, at least I'm physically part of the group that's sitting in, the chairs, right? Whereas in a virtual space, we all are in different spaces, our minds are in different places, we've left different activities to join a virtual session. So it was important to almost symbolically and intentionally create a common activity, a shared experience, so that everybody hopefully would be able to detach from what they were doing and attach to, this virtual group, right? So hence a warm-up is even more critical we felt in the virtual space than it would be, in good old pre-COVID days, right? The second was setting the context, which we already spoke about. We also kind of looked at any leftover things. We talked about transitions to the next session. Section 3, which is the actual body of the session plan, right? So here's where we ensured that there were experiential activities interspersed throughout, right? Whether they were videos, whether there were polls that we used, whether it was larger group brainstorming, we use visuals to elicit participation. I'm going to give you a taste of that in the simulation. A self-care break, of course, was important. 5 minutes. We didn't want it too long because often we'd lose people. So, I think the 5 minutes was, kind of almost like a magic number of just letting people, uh, you know, do whatever they needed to do in 5 minutes and kind of get back. And then we'd continue with the lesson plan. 6 and 7 were really important because while a lot of our information was facilitation, was also psychoeducational to some aspect, it had to be linked to what we call, their own realities, right? So in order to do that, there would usually be a summary of key learnings. We talk about ideas into action, which basically is, okay, so you learned about, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? How are you going to link that to the reality of what you're feeling now? Um, so it was important for us to do that. But I'll be honest, part of what we heard as a challenge was that because a lot of our people didn't have their cameras on, uh, it was hard to engage, right? So very often it would be one coach, and then what we also learned was it's good to have a co-facilitator like we're having right now, Damini and I, right? We're co-facilitating this because even if I can't see anybody else, I just look at Damini and like, whew, here's another human face that's responding to me. So I think, so that gives the energy to the coach to continue, right? So we felt that, it was important to have that co-facilitation process. And again, we'll talk in more depth about that. And the last, of course, was the end of the session, just doing a temperature check as people left. Again, capturing key learnings was important. Telling them what they're going to learn, the next time, or experience rather, the next time that we would meet. And one of the things that our coaches did, which I think was really helpful, was that they would always stay back. Right. So similar to, if you were to do a training program in the physical space, right? You always stay back, and usually there'll be one or two people who stay back to kind of connect with you because they didn't want to ask questions in the larger audience, right? So similarly, we kind of made sure that any of our virtual sessions, even as people logged off, the last person to log off would be the coach. And invariably for, at least a few sessions, we'd have one or two people that would stay back to just process something that they might have heard but weren't comfortable bringing up to the larger audience, right? So again, these were the elements that we kind of were intentional about, and we think, it went well. So now that I've kind of set the whole context up, and I know I've taken a lot of time kind of setting that up and speaking, but I'm hoping you all are, with both of us as I kind of went through that. We now are going to get into the fun part, right? Which is the actual experience of it. So we're going to hopefully walk you through just some elements, right? So like I said, this was a 6.5 hour to 8 hour training. But in the next 20 minutes, we're just going to give you a little teaser of some of the things that we did that we think that we felt, were critical to the success of this program. So it's time for us to have a simulation right now, and I'm going to hand it back to Damini, who's going to take us through module 1. Thanks, Damini.
Thanks, Aparna. So as we started interacting with the new joiners in the organization, as they started their training with us, in the introductory session of Gear Up, the focus was really on creating awareness on the importance of emotional health and self-care, helping the participants navigate through this and dismissing perceptions and stigma around emotional well-being and help seeking more so. Also, making them aware of all the services that were available to them. We started, Aparna, if you could move to the next start, we would start our session with a community agreement, which was more about being open and accepting each other's views, respecting each other's views, and sharing openly with everyone. Sorry. this enabled us. So as we move on to the next slide, we started with addressing some of the perceptions and social stigma in some of the geos or geographies rather, where we're based out of. There is still a significant amount of stigma and negative perception about emotional well-being and help seeking. And how do we get our people to start talking about it so that we could help address those concerns and perceptions? The methodology that we used was leveraging some of the comments that we'd heard from our employees in their conversations with HR or with our wellness coaches. And here's a glimpse of what actually comments or remarks that actually came from some of our employees. So they were great conversation openers. It helped the coaches kind of address each of these perceptions. It opened up, the space for people to talk about other perceptions and stigma related, uh, thoughts that they had. So it helped, and the coaches then were able to provide a rationale, help them dismiss some of those perceptions and become more open and accepting of the need of emotional well-being support, to build their emotional well-being and resilience. So that was, the primary focus in our introductory session with the individuals. As we walked them through, we also created awareness about situations in which, interaction with a wellness coach would be extremely beneficial. Uh, and we focused on what would be some of the, Aparna, if you could move to the next slide, on what were the benefits, right, of interacting with a coach. What are some of the uh, how the coach could help them manage their emotions, look at life more objectively. So the whole intent was to tell them about the importance of focusing on self-care, the benefits that a coach could provide, and how could they really gain from these interactions with the coaches and build an acceptance to reaching out for help when required. If we move on, the other things that we focused on during the session was making them aware of the range of services that were available to them, right from group sessions to individual coaching sessions, a 24/7 helpline number. And Aparna, we could move on, right? These were some details that we shared with them as we wrapped up our module 1 with them, and got them ready for the next step. And module 2 onwards, it was more about resilience tools.
Thank you so much, Damini. Yeah, thanks so much, Damini. So as we shared, there were 5 modules, right? So what module 1 was really the introduction and setting the context up and making them aware of the services that were available to them, which was the one-to-one and the group sessions which Damini spoke about. So once we kind of got that out of the way, the second thing that we did was cognitive behavioral toolkit, right, which of course was based on CBT. And I know CBT is heavy, so we went, we spent a lot of time in the design elements to kind of make sure that it was translated into a way that was easy for the layperson who would not understand psychology or doesn't have a background in it to still benefit from it, right? And again, remember, it's virtual. Many of our people had their cameras off. This was usually we would have about 20 to 25 people participants, employees during one session, right? So that's the backdrop. So just kind of reminding people of that. But here's a taste of some of the things we did when we spoke about CBT. And I know there's just a few of us here, but I'd love for us to kind of engage, even as you kind of see this, right? So what do you see on this slide? If you can just put it in the chat or even just unmute yourselves and let me know what you see here. So whoever's there, I request you to just put it in the chat. What do you see here? Or you can unmute yourselves. And I'll wait for maybe a couple seconds more. And if there's no response, then I'll share the answer, right? Okay, good. So what we see here is it's a horse, right? Or at least the image looks like a horse, right? Now we move to the next slide, and you see that it's a frog, right? You go back, it's a horse, and you move here, and it's a frog, right? So essentially, what we were trying to tell people is that, when you see it's basically the same image, right? But it's just turned on its head, right? So there's something that looks like a frog, and then depending on where you are looking at it, it's a frog, right? So a frog or a horse. And so we would ask our people, what does this tell you, right? And one of the things that we heard most often was, well, it depends on your perspective. And so if any of you were thinking of that, then that's the right answer, right? It depends on your perspective. Where you're standing, it can either look like a frog or it could look like a horse, right? And that's the way we introduce the concept of cognitive behavioral therapy, because that sounds like a mouthful, right? CBT is a mouthful. So that's how we introduce the concept that CBT basically is really starting with our thinking patterns, right? That depending on the way we think, that impacts our perception, right? So it is not the event themselves, right? For example, the picture was the same, right? It's the same picture, but depending on where I stand and how I look at it, that impacts my belief and perception, and that in turn will affect the way I think or feel or act in a given situation. So that was the setup that we used for CBT. As you can see, it was a simple visual, that got people's attention. The other thing that we did, as we spoke about building resilience, remember this was a resilience building toolkit, right? So one of the methods, we're not going to go into all three, just the middle one, is known as a perspective lens. So here again, we use a catchy visual to kind of illustrate a point. So for example, this is the slide that we would show them, and we would ask them, well, when you look at this, what do you see? Usually we'd hear stuff like, well, looks like some black rods, looks like there's some lines on the computer, which really doesn't make sense. It looks like something's randomly placed, but something's in front of a field. So I can see the green grass, but this kind of looks like it's something that's in the way. So these are some of the random answers we will hear people say. We would then move to the next slide. And again, we'd ask them to put this in the chat, because like I said, a lot of people may not have been, speaking or had the cameras on, but the chat function was something that worked well. So we'd request them to put it in the chat. And then using that same visual, the next slide would be this, right? Where we would say, okay, you know what? Now taking a couple steps back, right? Here's what that visual looks like. Does it make more sense now? They're like, not really. I know it's something that's big, but it's still not completely making sense, right? But as I'm putting distance between me and that visual that you just showed us, something seems to be forming, but I'm not quite sure what it is, right? So this was the second slide we would show them. Again, the third slide, right, is when it would all come together. And essentially, this was an artwork that was created with 50 iron rods, right? And this was created by Marco Ciunfenelli, and I, want to make sure we got his name right. And this kind of sits on the spot where President Mandela was arrested. So this is really 50 iron rods. That's what this is, right? But when you're really close, it doesn't make sense. As you kind of start stepping away, right, the picture starts forming. And and then eventually, when at enough of a distance, I'm able to see what this was actually meant to be. So again, using this as a conversation starter, we helped people realize that there was something known as the power of perspective of our problems, right? If I'm too close, my problem is going to seem huge, as we see in this simple illustration here, right? But as I take a step back, I realized that, hey, you know what? Phew, my problem wasn't as big as I thought it was, right? But the key is putting emotional and cognitive distance between me and my problem, right? So part of the way we would use this then is helping people take a mindful pause. So at this point, we would also introduce the concept of mindfulness. What does mindfulness mean? What does it mean to take a mindful pause? What am I standing too close to? Am I standing too close to something and hence it's seeming more overwhelming than it should? Should I take 2 steps back? Because as I take more steps back, maybe this, I'm looking at it from a larger macro level perspective and things make more sense. So we asked them to kind of just pause and reflect and, think about what in their life right now do they feel they're too close to, right? It could be a work related situation, it could be a personal situation, it could be just anxiety, larger anxiety around COVID, the fear of infection. For a lot of our young people, who were in relationships because of COVID, now a lot of their relationships were forced into, becoming long distance relationships. So what did that mean for them? Many of them had to go back and live as young adults. They had to go back and live with their parents, right? And what did that do for them? What did it do for their parents? While there was an initial honeymoon period, where it was fun to be with family, then we saw that there was boundaries that people were finding hard to juggle, right? So whatever it might have been, whether it was work or life outside of work, right? And I guess within the COVID space, work and life anyway was so blurred, it was hard for people to kind of create clear boundaries. But this was an exercise we used to help them to just pause and reflect, right? And then we'd ask them, okay, now share in chat, what would you need to step back from? And in most of our chats, we would get at least 70%, 60 to 70% of a response. So there would always still be some people who wouldn't respond. But I think 60 to 70% is a great number, right? If we had about 20 people, there were at least 14 plus people that were kind of responding back, which we were thrilled about. So we used that a lot. So that was session one. We gave you a taste of that. Module two, we gave you a taste of that. And I'm skipping from module three. Module three was essentially on gratefulness and mindfulness. And I'm going to show you a little mindfulness activity towards the end if we have time, but I'm going to move into very quickly module four, right? So module four started, if you recall, we had and I'm going back, but in pre-process, which is before they even have a sense of what the work might entail, we did module one, two, and three. Then there's a 2 week gap. They start engaging with the training that's specific to the work. And at that point, our coaches would re-enter. So there's a 2 week gap. Remember, there's a 2 week gap. People would then re-enter, and we would start with the social and emotional intelligence toolkit, right? And this is something, SEL is something we've all either been exposed to or read about. So I'm not going to go into too much details as to what does social and emotional intelligence mean. But here's one of the things that we did. If you remember, there was a 7 key story bowling elements. So I'm going to show you very quickly a mindfulness activity that we did with our people. And I'm hoping the audio shows. If not, Damini, just let me know. I can always share the link and everybody can see it later on.
Yeah, the audio is
you hear it
not
now?
there. No.
Take a few slow, deep breaths.
Yeah, it starts.
And slow down. As you free your mind from all unnecessary thoughts. You feel your mind being transported to a serene and tranquil environment. You're standing near a waterfall that's cascading down the mountainside. The air is warm and fragrant, with an aroma of sweet tropical flowers. There's the sound of exotic birds, a lush green surrounds you. As you enjoy the
So I think that got paused there, right? You guys still hear it?
No, it got paused, Aparna.
It got paused, yes. I just thought in the interest of time, because we just have a little less than 10 minutes left, Just wanted to kind of give you a sample of, some of the meditation activities that we used. And the coaches that we worked with, they have an app. So that app was really, of course, shared with everybody. And so they could go back and listen to, some of the, uh, you know, what the coaches themselves actually had kind of created. So while this is more from outside of the geographies that we worked in, we kind of made sure that we also got some in the voices and the pictures of the same geographies that we were kind of operating from. So it was important to get, as I mentioned, that the cultural element in. So good. So we see that the other thing that we spoke a lot about was under emotional and social intelligence was this concept of self-compassion, right? So it is important for us to talk to people about what does self-compassion mean, right? And I think especially given the landscape of COVID, where it's so easy for us to be critical of ourselves, be critical of others, feel that nothing is good enough. It's unfortunately a ripe environment for anxiety and criticism to increase, and people to just be irritable with themselves or with others. So a lot of our focus also was just on compassion, right? Compassion and grace towards others. Cutting yourself a long rope, cutting other people a long rope. And so we introduced this concept of self-compassion. First of all, what is compassion? And then compassion towards others. And then very important, self-compassion, which is part of, the self-care element. So this was really used as a discussion starter. And these are some of the kind of questions that we used, to introduce people. Here's another activity that's an example of an individual activity, right? So people would kind of think about 5 qualities that they like about themselves, and then we would open Menti, which is used for polls in the web browser. They would put in their, plug in their thoughts. And the reason this was important was, again, this was one way in the virtual space that we were able to get people excited about just engaging, right? Because I think engaging was the biggest challenge that we felt that we faced. So this was one way that, again, we used, what resources that were available to us to help people engage with the material. The other was motivation and meaning from work, right? I think a lot of people, and I'm not sure if any of you kind of face this. I can speak from my personal example. Definitely, right? I mean, what's the meaning from my work, right? At a certain stage in your life, you want to make sure that what you're doing is meaningful, right? You want to make sure that there's an impact that it's having. It's not just about, the money or the status, but what I am doing, does it have meaning to anybody else apart from me, right? Sure, it makes my life comfortable when I work, but does it have meaning to anybody else, right? So I think it was important for us to kind of help people. And I think the younger people are, and the faster they see it, the easier it is, right? So you don't have to hit my age well into my 40s and then realize, okay, there has to be more to work than just a paycheck, right? So it was important for us to try and bring that internal or that intrinsic motivation, right? And more so given COVID, right? People needed to know why they were doing what they were doing, and especially linked to the nature of work that they were involved in. So one of the things that we did, again, just to make it more culturally sensitive, was to link it back to popular media, right? So this is Amir Khan. For those of you that are into Indian movies would know who he is. He's huge, right? So we kind of used relevant movies, popular actors, to illustrate the example of what it means to be passionate about your work. Because when you're passionate about your job, it feels less like work, right? So we would, use this again as a conversation starter for people. Similarly, here's another video that we use that we got, great feedback on, where we talk to people about the fact that emotions are our consultants and not our CEOs. We also spoke about the fact that, hey, you know what? Part of the human experience is experiencing all emotions, the sadness as well as, the more so-called positive emotions, right? And emotions are really a mirror, right? It just tells you what you're feeling, right? But it isn't you, it doesn't define you 100%. So just because I'm feeling sad today, it doesn't mean I'm going to be feeling sad constantly, right? But if I'm feeling sad, I need to embrace it. I need to acknowledge it, and I need to process it through. So we used this movie, and I'm sure many of you have kind of heard of this movie. Again, a lot of our people that we were working with specifically in this account were young. So, we felt it was important to meet them and speak in a language that they get, which is, movies and music. So it made sense for us to do that. So here's something, like I said, if you remember the 7, key aspects, one of the things that we did at the end of every session was key takeaways, right? So it was important that everybody, right, and this was something that we try to hold people to, right, that what's your key takeaway? One key takeaway, document it. Because when people are able to document their key takeaways, it's almost a visual reminder. It's also a way of them taking more emotional ownership of what they took away from the session. So there may have been 10 things we spoke about, but even if they took away one thing and made it their own, we were good to go. It was a success as far as we were concerned, right? And we'd end with something like this, right? Start here, go anywhere. This is just the beginning. This is really for you to kind of get to know yourself, your coaches better, for you to be able to take a step in the positive direction. So good. So that brings us to the end of that, and I'm glad we're on track as far as our timing goes. And I'll hand this back to Damini, and she's going to take us through, some of the data piece of this. All yours,
Thanks,
Damini.
Aparna.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So Aparna did talk about the knowledge, attitudes, and behavior assessment that we run right before we take them through the training module, the 5-module Gear Up session. Right. And one of the questions that we ask at the start, as well as after the training is completed, is, I believe only emotionally weak people seek counseling. And the number of people who agreed to this statement being true was about 18%. This is from a sample, one of the set of people that went through the training. So close to 19% actually had agreed that that statement was true. That number dropped to 10% at the end of their training. So the 8.8% of the people shifted, their point of view or their perception about, only emotionally weak people reaching out for help. What we did very recently was, 6 months after they had undergone this training, we went back and asked the same question again. Right. And we saw a further dip in the number that felt that that statement was true. And now, in our recent interaction with them, 92% of the people felt that, this statement did not hold true. And there was only 8% of the participants or the respondents who continue to believe that it was only emotionally weak. So, you're seeing a long lasting impact of the information that we're sharing with them. And that was one of the primary intents, right? How do we build acceptance for people to reach out to seek help? Was for them to help them overcome some of these perceptions, and we be kind of achieving that, or we that's clearly coming out from the study. Another question that was asked, as a follow-up when we had a follow-up connect with them, was if the question that I'm more aware of self-care and mental well-being due to the Gear Up sessions, and 91% of the respondents to the survey agreed that Gear Up did help build that awareness on self-care as well as mental well-being. I'm more connected to the coaches as they conducted. So coaches, as you enter a new organization, there's a whole lot of anxiety and anticipation on what you're coming. And the first few people that you interact with do leave a lasting impression. And our wellness coaches who interact with our new joiners, and as they start their training in the initial few days of their training, they do leave a lasting impression because the new joiners were able to connect with them, relate to them, and and these are the same coaches that do continue to provide them the resilience services after they finish the training and they come onto the floor. So there's that positive connect. So we are seeing benefits of the session, and we seem to be achieving what we set out to when we launched this program. that, Aparna, back to you.
Thank you so much, Damini, for that. So yeah, so the numbers were enlightening and encouraging, right? And though we've trained about 1,500 people, this is a small slice that we kind of looked at, to share feedback on. So as we kind of wrap up, we thought we'd kind of just leave with some of our key challenges and learnings, and we kind of put this in three buckets, right? First was the logistics. So if you recall, I had mentioned that we had designed this as an ATA, but as we went along, thanks to Zoom fatigue, which we all have, kind of experienced, as well as, it's hard for people to be as attentive in the virtual space. So we shortened our sessions, right? Especially in the beginning, right? So the last session was still a little longer because by then there was a rapport build, there was enough interest that was peaked for people, but the shorter sessions definitely in the beginning. Didn't have more than 20 participants because we needed to make sure that there was enough interaction. So we would, because at times we could have had at least 30-35 people join a session, but we were very purposeful and intentional about not just rushing people through this for the sake of it and a checkbox item. We wanted to make sure that as far as possible we wouldn't have more than 20 participants. Like we shared earlier, co-facilitators were ideal because there's someone who's managing the chat function while someone else was conducting the session. So as far as possible, we try to get co-facilitators in. So that was some of the logistical piece that fed into our challenges and learning. From a content design, I've already spoken about some of them. What I want to kind of just focus more on was that because most of our people were visually invisible, right? They didn't have their cameras on. We needed to make a very concerted effort to try and use either the chat function or use storyboarding elements. So there's constant touch points, whether it's a little video, whether it's a little poll, whether it's a little image that we use to kind of initiate conversations. So it was important from a content that the design was very different than if it was in the pre-COVID, real-time, or rather face-to-face in real-time session, right? So we definitely saw that there was a difference and we learned as we went along the way. The last piece was the people variable. So from the very beginning, and I think that was the slide that, Damini kind of spoken about 100% commitment on my end as a facilitator, because for me also, when I'm not engaging with people, it's easy for the coaches to get discouraged, right? Because they can't feed off the people's energy, right? It's almost like you're just looking at yourself at a screen and talking, right? So there had to be, almost a retraining even for the coaches in their own minds that, hey, this is a different way of connecting. So emotional ownership for both the coaches as well as the participants, right? That this is virtual, we're here together, let's make the most of it. So we were intentional about that. Very intentional about getting buy-in from senior leadership as well as the immediate managers, right? So the team leads as well as the senior leadership, we got kind of messaging from them, and that was shared with the new employees so that they knew that this is something that was important to the organization from top down. The last piece, of course, was, coaches, I already spoke about them, they had to appear even bigger online. When I say bigger online, I mean that they sometimes had to have more of a performance, right? Because you have to hold the engagement for, for the participants. So we kind of, encouraged our coaches to attend, trainings where they was train the trainers on specific strategies that they could use to be even more effective in the online space. Because what we found was just because you're effective in, in a physical space, it doesn't necessarily translate into you being effective in the virtual space. So new tricks had to be, learned by the coaches. So these are some of our key challenges and learnings, and this brings us to the end of our session. Thank you all again. And if there are any questions, please put it in the chat. If not, we're a small group. We can, just connect with each other. Thank you all again.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk and what I imagine must have been an invaluable start to their time with your organisation. If anyone has any other questions, do put them in chat. I'll actually start with a question of my own. You mentioned that for some of your participants, they'd suddenly found themselves moving home as young adults. I know that some of my friends were trying to pretend that they weren't accompanied by their small children as they tried to do their work. Did those sorts of issues come up during the course, and how were they addressed if they did?
Mm-hmm. Imogen, sorry, I actually missed the question. I'm sorry about that. Could you just repeat it? Because
yes.
I think the Wi-Fi was a little sketchy.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I was saying that you mentioned that some of your participants had moved home to their parents, and I know that some of my friends were trying to pretend they weren't accompanied by their small children as they started work, and I wondered if that came up and how you integrated it into the course, if so.
No, thank you so much for asking that question, Imogen. So you're right. So most of our people were, in the age group of maybe, early to mid 20s, maybe 27, 28 at the most. So most of them were not, didn't have children. Most of them, some did, but most of them didn't. I think the challenge really was that a lot of them had, flown the nest, right? And they were kind of living independent in a larger city, whereas their parents were still perhaps in smaller hometowns. They were living independently or with their friends, and they had that taste of independence and creating their own rules to live by. And now kind of going back, almost back to college days or even pre-college days where they were living with their parents. I think initially there was an excitement and there was that honeymoon phase of, yes, I get to spend time with my parents, and I'm sure it was on both ends. But then later on we did see that there was a little bit of friction. So we, to your point, we actually conducted sessions on just how do you manage relationships within the family, right? When suddenly your office mates are your family, right? It's not your peer anymore, but my office space is being shared with family, right? Or even in my case, even animals, right? A dog that's constantly running in and out. So just practical tips on how do you manage that? How do you create, a small space to market as your own? We did have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Damini, but we did have parenting during COVID for those with younger kids, giving them practical examples of what they could do. How do you take breaks between, your work so that you're going checking in with the family and you're kind of coming back. So we did. We had to, again, like I said, the need was constantly evolving. We learned, to be honest, as we went along. We didn't have all the answers, and I don't think anybody had all the answers. We were kind of sometimes stuff up and just trying it out and seeing if it worked, and if it didn't, then we go back creatively. But yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you. And if there aren't
Damini, did I miss anything out?
No. Oh, sorry.
No, Aparna, your internet was a little intermittent in between. I froze, but I think we caught all of what you said.
Okay,
right,
thanks.
Imogen?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. That was interesting to hear. I had one actual follow-up question, which was about technology, because obviously, usually when you start a job, you arrive in an office and you're typically provided with the technology you're going to use. I imagine that was logistically more challenging during the pandemic, and I also so I was wondering how that worked, because I know that for other people they've suddenly found themselves with different types of technology, and not everyone had the same kit. So how did that work in terms of the sort of resilience and accessing the course?
Damini, do you want to take that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll take that. So, Imogen, these were our new joiners trainings to start, and this was part of their process training. So, for them to start with the process training, the organization needed to equip them with, either desktops or laptops. And those were shipped out to them because in the pandemic, it wasn't always possible for people to come to the office space, right? So, wherever possible, we did that. And so they had their office systems to log in and leverage the platform that was being used by the coaches. And these days most of the youngsters have smartphones, so yeah, it was either the office device or their phones with so that was not actually one of the challenges that we faced. In some of the folks living in remote areas, connectivity isn't that great. That was so bandwidth issues, for and that's why that was another reason why a lot of or most of the participants prefer to keep their videos off, right, to save the bandwidth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think I don't think we have any further questions. So I'd like to thank you both again for a really interesting and inspiring talk, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And that brings us
Thanks,
to the end of
Damini.
this. Thank
Yeah.
you. This session.
Thanks so much. Bye, Damini. See you. Yeah, bye, everyone.
Bye.